Welcome to the Brehl Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Nicholas Brehl. Thank you for joining us. We'll start out today with the second installment of Brehl Brief, since there was a lot of news to talk about, and we're going to talk about what we can do about gun control next week, since there's so much news to cover. I want to give credit to the artist of the intro song. That was by a band called Omnia, and the track was called Al Dente. We played the song last week, but we forgot to give them credit for it, so we are playing it again this week. You can check out the band's website in the description. Now, before we move on to the news, I want to make a quick correction. I incorrectly referred to the Secretary of Homeland Security last week as Christian Nielsen. Her name is not Christian Nielsen. Her name is Kirsten Nielsen. Kirsten Nielsen. So, sorry about that. I want to remain as accurate as I possibly can. Now, on to the news. First of all, touch of good news, also relating to Homeland Security and Trump's immigration policy. An ICE spokesman recently resigned because he did not want to work for an administration that lies. It was one lie in particular that led him to quit, which was a lie regarding a statement by officials saying that 800 immigrants avoided arrest because the mayor of Oakland warned the city about immigration raids before they took place. This ICE spokesperson believed that the number was too high, that it was not 800, and as a result, he quit. The administration relies on lies to stay alive, and anyone who supports it knowing about the falsehoods is also a liar. So hearing about this was good news to me. Last week I called on Kirsten Nielsen to quit her job amid her statement that she would not apologize for doing her job. I'm glad that one member of ICE has at least quit. Moving on, I want to talk now about Trump's pick to head the Treasury's Civil Rights Program, Joseph Otting. I was watching clips from his testimony from a Now This video, and this man is incredibly unqualified to head such a program based on his testimony before Congress. When asked if he believed discrimination exists in America, he equivocated and said, "I know people who say it exists." So he never said he believed it exists, and we have to assume that that is what he believes. When he was asked if there was ever discrimination in banking, he said he has never personally observed it, but he never answered the question, "Do you believe that there has been discrimination in banking?" So we have to assume, since he had plenty of opportunities to answer the question, that he doesn't believe that. And anyone with any knowledge of history should know that banks have been incredibly involved in discrimination. It used to be pretty difficult for women to get credit cards because of banks' discrimination towards them, and that prompted Congress to pass the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in 1974, which mandated banks not discriminate based on race, color, religion, national origin, sex, marital status, age, or whether you get public assistance. Apparently, Mr. Otting does not know what redlining or blockbusting was, a practice that allowed banks to profit off of disparities in property values that existed solely because certain homeowners were black. One Congressman, Emanuel Cleaver, was just not buying it, and asked Mr. Otting, "Did you see what happened in Charlottesville?" To which Mr. Otting replied, "I don't watch TV." Okay, well, there are some people who don't watch TV, so when Congressman Cleaver asked him if he read about it in the newspapers, Mr. Otting said, "I don't read a newspaper." This is kind of like, this is a public official saying he doesn't watch the news or read the news. That's kind of like saying, "I'm a plumber, but I'm afraid of human waste." This was followed by one of the longest pauses I've ever witnessed a government official make. Mr. Cleaver was clearly not buying this, and the American people should not buy this. Mr. Otting said he plans to overhaul a hallmark of the Civil Rights Act, the Community Reinvestment Act, which, according to the Federal Reserve website, is, quote, "The Community Reinvestment Act is intended to encourage depository institutions, aka banks, to help meet the credit needs of the communities in which they operate, including low and moderate income neighborhoods consistent with safe and sound operations." This act was meant to reform communities that have been victims of segregation and discrimination throughout history. And when Senator Sherrod Brown asked if he would overhaul the act only with the support of the civil rights community, all Mr. Otting said was that they would be at the table. So we have to assume he meant no. This man cannot be approved. He should not be improved. And we should vote out any congressperson or senator who votes to approve him, because he clearly does not know anything about discrimination. The EPA has approved the use of nerve gas pesticide. I learned from another recent Now This editorial. They've approved the use of chloropyrifos, I believe I'm pronouncing it correctly, as a pesticide that companies can use on our food, as well as this pesticide has some disastrous effects on consumers. The pesticide is manufactured by Dow Chemical, one of the biggest companies in the United States, and the chemical is one of many agents that was derived from nerve gas made by the Nazis during World War II. Scientists have shown that even small doses of this agent leads to reduced IQ and is linked to autism and ADHD. This does not just affect those consuming the fruits and vegetables that the product is sprayed on. In 2012, scientists tested the blood in the umbilical cords of fetuses and pregnant women in the community around a California farm, and 87% of the cords tested positive for nerve gas. The American agricultural system is one of the most messed up in the world, and this happened because of good intentions. During the Nixon administration, we began subsidizing farms to make produce cheaper as a result of a newly declared war on hunger. We rightfully decided it was unacceptable that children in Appalachia had their teeth falling out and were starving. However, these subsidies have led to some of the most well-off companies receiving taxpayer dollars to poison us. The obsession with making food cheaper has also led to the mistreatment of animals, the spraying of toxic chemicals on our food, and the use of unsustainable fossil fuel as fertilizer for these crops. These practices are contributing to global warming, pollution, and illness among our population. This is a whole nother show, and I want to talk about it more in depth in the future. But even if we are to allow these pesticides in our food, we should at least be labeling the food to warn people. But this is not the answer. We should not be putting these on our food. We need to ban these chemicals and end the farm subsidies, and instead address the rampant income and wealth inequality that affects America. It is not acceptable that 48.8 million Americans in the richest country in the world live in households that, according to Mashable, I quote, lack the means to get enough nutritious food on a regular basis. As a result, about 1 in 5 children go hungry at some point during the year, unquote. We need to address the rampant income inequality in America. We need to ensure that our poorest citizens are eligible to receive government assistance either through welfare or through more practical systems like the negative income tax or universal basic income. And we need to ensure that regulations are put in place that mandate large agricultural conglomerates engage in sustainable and safe practices. We'll talk more about Trump's EPA and Scott Pruitt in future shows, but for now I want to talk about some good news, believe it or not. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez beat incumbent Democratic Congressman Joe Crowley, who was expected, believe it or not, to be the new House Minority Leader, by a margin, and she beat him by a big margin. She beat him by a margin of 57.5% to 42.5%. That is ridiculously high. If she wins, which she likely will since she's in New York, she would be the youngest woman elected to Congress. She is a self-proclaimed democratic socialist who believes in free college, Medicare for all, a federal jobs guarantee, and she is calling for abolishing ICE, which, believe it or not, is actually a fairly recent division that was created under the George W. Bush administration. So this is good news. Now, on to the rest of the bad news. The European Union has put in place retaliatory tariffs on American motorcycles in response to Trump's tariffs on Europe. In response, iconic American motorcycle company Harley Davidson just announced it would be moving some of its jobs overseas to avoid these tariffs. This just goes to show that international trade is not a zero-sum game. Despite Trump's efforts to preserve jobs, this has already shown it will end up costing U.S. jobs, and the tariffs on the foreign goods he has already implemented will, based on conventional economic wisdom, likely cause price increases on imports. I know that Trump has said these tariffs are to preserve our national security, but there really isn't any evidence to show this. If anything, this is exacerbating ties with our allies and actually threatening national security. Trade wars are bad for America. It was a trade war that likely was one of the factors leading to the Great Recession. They exacerbate national security. And these are only some of the ways that they are bad. The other one being that they raise prices for consumers. I want to talk about another action that Trump took, which is the latest statement he made about immigration, particularly in regards to due process. Donald Trump wants to deport illegal immigrants without giving them a hearing that they are entitled to under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. He complained that currently it is taking too long to deport people. He said that adding 5,000 new judges would be too cumbersome of a process, and therefore he wants to deport people without giving them a hearing. Now, this is problematic. For one, this is unconstitutional. This is not unlike Trump. In fact, it's not unlike several members of the Republican Party. For example, under the George W. Bush administration, we have detained people in Guantanamo Bay, foreign terrorist suspects, without giving them a fair trial. Ron Paul, a libertarian, has advocated, or at least suggested, that we should modify the birthright citizenship that a number of legal experts believe is entitled to us by the Constitution, that we should clarify that language, that the Constitution does not apply to non-citizens. Even Rand Paul, Ron Paul's son, once said that the Constitution does not apply to people outside the U.S. So this is not unlike Trump, and this is not unlike other Republicans. In the past, Trump has pushed for and campaigned for various unconstitutional measures. This particular measure would likely be thrown out of court if it were implemented, but one wonders if this would actually happen given the rate that Trump is pushing unqualified and far-right justices through the Congress and into our court system, both lower and higher federal courts. But this is also problematic for other reasons. First of all, this could very well mean that American citizens end up being deported. The problem with waiving the Due Process Clause for illegal aliens is that a big part of the hearings they have, a big factor that takes place in the hearings, is that the judge has to decide whether or not the person being tried is in fact an illegal alien. Even though it is illegal for ICE to detain American citizens, hundreds are detained each year, according to NPR. These individuals often have to go through extensive measures to collect the paperwork required to prove their citizenship. Imagine if suddenly ICE had the unlimited power to deport anybody whom it deemed likely not a U.S. citizen. The courts have already given the federal government a ridiculous amount of power to enforce our immigration laws, much to the expense of the rights of American citizens. The Border Patrol can set up checkpoints at distances as far as 100 miles from the border. That's the entire state of Florida, all of Maine, and all of New Hampshire. And these Border Patrol agents often abuse their power, holding American citizens who have done nothing wrong hostage for the crime of living 100 miles or closer to the border. Even if we were to waive the Due Process Clause for ICE agents to deport illegal aliens, it would still be impossible to deport the estimated 11 million in this country. We know from history that when the United States passes unenforceable laws, it leads to arbitrary enforcement. When the government has the opportunity to pick and choose who it prosecutes, it tends to choose people of darker skin. Look at how our failed war on drugs has affected black people, which a Nixon aide later admitted was an effort to throw black people and hippies in jail. Look at how the policies of Sheriff Joe Arpaio, a blatant racist who Trump pardoned in an affront to the rule of law, have affected members of the Hispanic community in Arizona. He targeted them during traffic stops, even 18 months after a court order was issued telling him to stop. Not only will this end up leading to deportation of American citizens if implemented, which it likely will, but it will also disproportionately affect minority Americans. Let us make no mistake, our president is a racist. He said he wanted to admit more Norwegian immigrants to the country and not as many immigrants from shithole countries like Nigeria. The United States government is already ending a protected status for Haitians by July 2019. He has been quick to help Texas and Florida, states that he won in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. But he has not been so quick to help the people of Puerto Rico and their recovery efforts. These are only two examples of the demonstrable racism of this president and this administration. I say this not to gloat, but as a severe message to those Hispanics and African Americans who voted for Trump. Do you really want to support this policy? The Supreme Court has recently ruled on Trump's travel ban and has said it is constitutional. Though I am an aspiring law student, I do not believe I know enough about constitutional law to warrant an opinion on all the cases that the Supreme Court has ruled on this week. But I feel I should offer my input on this particular case nonetheless. After reading about the case, I believe either Trump has fooled the 5 conservative justices into implementing a Muslim ban, or those justices know they are violating, that they ruled against the Constitution. One of the questions at hand was whether Trump had the authority as president to implement this ban, and the other was whether he was implementing the ban in a constitutional manner. Now, I think there is little question as to whether the president has the right to institute travel bans. He does. Current immigration law allows him to do so. However, I believe this particular ban violates the Establishment Clause of the Constitution in its implementation. The court reviewed the 3rd travel ban that the Trump administration put forth. The first included solely Muslim-majority countries. This particular travel ban included Venezuela and North Korea. In deciding whether this was constitutional or not, the Supreme Court chose to apply the rational basis test. The rational basis test is the lowest of 3 levels of scrutiny the court uses in determining whether an act is constitutional or not. The other 2 are intermediate and strict scrutiny. Strict scrutiny is applied when a suspect class of people, essentially a class mentioned in the Constitution such as race, sex, or religion, strict scrutiny is applied when the rights of those such groups are in question. The Supreme Court chose not to apply strict scrutiny, presumably because this act did not explicitly target Muslims. However, we cannot ignore that President Trump campaigned on enacting a Muslim ban. And that Rudy Giuliani, you know how smart he is, said Trump privately asked him how he could legally institute a Muslim ban. In applying the rational basis test, all the Supreme Court had to assert was that the ban was applied for some legitimate governmental purpose. Any reason, essentially. And in this case, the reason was national security, even though the chance of being killed by a refugee terrorist is only 1 in 3.6 billion, according to Big Think. You know, there is a book recently published by, I believe, an award-winning economist. I believe he won the Pulitzer Prize, called Thinking Fast and Slow. And it essentially demonstrated that one of the flaws in a free market system is that the assumption that people are rational isn't actually the correct assumption. People don't think rationally. They tend to think quickly because we evolved to think quickly to get ourselves out of dangerous situations when we were hunter-gatherers. And studies show that the average person, if they can save $10 on, let's say, a $30 radio, if they go to a store and they can buy a radio for $30 at that store, but they can buy a $20 radio at a different store, they will go to the different store to save the $10. But for some reason, if they are spending money on, let's say, a $200 item, and they can buy the same item at a different store for $190, they will stick with the $200 item even though they are saving the same amount of money. In other words, change the background factors a little bit, and even if you get the same result, people will still choose different actions. This is essentially what happened with the ruling today. Trump's ban was obviously intentioned to ban Muslims. The courts weren't buying it, so he threw in a couple of other non-Muslim countries, North Korea and Venezuela, and suddenly that changed the equation. That this was a ban instituted for national security reasons, even though, these countries have never actually attacked us. In Saudi Arabia, that's where practically all the 9/11 attackers were from. But so there's that. And then there's the fact that, it's not a Muslim ban. We were inclusive. We threw in Venezuela and North Korea, and the Supreme Court said, okay, not a Muslim ban. I'd like to think that this type of irrational thinking doesn't fool the leading minds in our legal system. But unfortunately it did. Perhaps the most incompetent, unintelligent president in United States history fooled the top legal minds in our government. And as a result, thousands of men, women, and children fleeing violence from their home countries will pay the price. After a week of consequential Supreme Court rulings, Anthony Kennedy has announced his retirement. Now, this is bad news, and it could not have come at a more aggravating time. Anthony Kennedy, despite being a conservative, sometimes sided with liberals and served as the swing vote on the court. If Trump succeeds in appointing one of his picks to the Supreme Court, we could see a rollback in our Fourth Amendment rights. I would remind everybody that the cell phone case I discussed last week, which basically said that the Supreme Court said that the police need a warrant to get your geographical data that's being held by your cell phone provider. The Supreme Court said that the police need a warrant for that. I would mention that Neil Gorsuch and all the conservative justices, with the exception of John Robert, voted to allow the police the ability to get the warrant. It was only because of John Roberts that we are protected. So we could see a rollback in our Fourth Amendment rights, voting rights, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, environmental protection, and more if we don't block Trump's next appointee. I would like to point out first and foremost that the Senate has the right to block any Trump appointee not named Merrick Garland. Mitch McConnell refused even to hold hearings for Obama's nominee Merrick Garland, resulting in the longest vacancy on the Supreme Court in United States history. Merrick Garland should be on the court right now. He should have been the vote for the cases that Gorsuch has been voting on. While for the sake of national unity we need to honor the Supreme Court's decisions, even those that Gorsuch votes on, we need to make sure that we don't tolerate obstruction. The Republican Party has been acting incredibly unprincipled while the Democrats have been taking punches left and right. We need to make clear that until they back down, Democrats, and frankly all those who stand for respect, civility, and decency, will be on the defensive. The future of a whole bunch of vulnerable people and the future of human rights in this country depends on our immediate action. We need to do whatever we can to filibuster any appointee not named Merrick Garland. Now, back to the Harley Davidson case. You may remember Jeff Flake as the senator who gave a scathing speech against Trump after he decided not to run for re-election. And after watching a recent edition of Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC, I found out something rather astonishing, that Jeff Flake may actually be able to stop Trump from appointing a Supreme Court pick. You see, Jeff Flake does not believe Trump should be allowed to unilaterally institute the tariffs he has been putting on Europe. The only reason Trump can do this is because under current U.S. law, the president can impose tariffs on other countries if he or she does so for national security reasons. Under the Constitution, Congress, not the president, Congress, has the sole authority to impose tariffs. Jeff Flake does not want to close this loophole. He simply wants to modify it such that the president would need to request congressional approval before instituting these tariffs. Republican leadership does not want to do this because the last thing they want to do before the midterm elections is clash with Trump. Jeff Flake, however, only has until the end of his term to achieve his objective because he is not seeking re-election and he is not bonded to his constituents. Seeking leverage, Jeff Flake decided to use his position as a member of the Judiciary Committee to achieve his objective. As the crucial voting member on the committee, which is made up of 11 Republicans and 10 Democrats, Jeff Flake has said he would not approve any more judges until, as he said on an ABC News interview with George Stephanopoulos, we get a vote, for example, on tariffs. He said, "We will not move forward until we, quote, get a vote, for example, on tariffs," unquote. Little did Jeff Flake know that Anthony Kennedy would be announcing his retirement so soon. If Jeff Flake stays true to his words, this will put the Senate in a predicament. Either fight against Trump's tariffs or don't confirm his Supreme Court pick. The GOP has a 51-49 majority in the Senate. Despite the fact that 3 Democrats who won in Trump country, specifically Joe Donnelly of Indiana, Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, and Joe Manchin of West Virginia, voted for Gorsuch, they may be pressured to vote the other way should Jeff Flake break with his party. I don't know if Jeff Flake will break with his party. He did, after all, for example, vote in favor of the GOP tax bill. But he is our best chance to block Trump's next nominee. How do we do this? My best idea is to spread the word. Make the entire world know that the future of the United States lies in Jeff Flake's hands. Maybe this will remind Jeff Flake that he has the chance to be remembered quite favorably in the history books. He has the chance to save the United States of America. Lastly, there was another mass shooting, this time in a Maryland newsroom. We'll talk next week about the details and what the United States can learn from other countries about gun control. All I can say now is that we need to do more than thoughts and prayers. We need to take action. And now is the best time to talk about gun control. Because the NRA has a chokehold on our politicians, and in order to get any gun reform done at all, we will need to be extremely vocal. That is evidently the only thing that works. That's our show. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, like this video, follow us on social media, and follow me, Nicholas Brehl, on social media. Thank you.
You're always on my mind.